Welcome to Atlas Explained, where every border carries a hidden story. In the summer of 1798, French warships appeared off the coast of Egypt, carrying an expedition that was not meant to conquer Cairo alone. Napoleon Bonaparte was attempting to strike at the British Empire by projecting French power into the eastern Mediterranean and threatening the trade routes that linked Britain to India. Egypt was selected not because it was weak, but because it was central. Control of the province meant influence over the arteries of imperial commerce. The Ottoman Empire's inability to defend Egypt revealed more than a military failure. Local governors could not mobilize coordinated resistance, and the Mamluk elites who shared authority over the province were unable to act as a unified political body. The French advance exposed an administrative reality that had been hidden by centuries of habit. Egypt was no longer governed by a system capable of defending itself, financing its own security, or enforcing its own hierarchy. When British intervention and political developments in France forced the French withdrawal, Ottoman authority returned in form rather than in substance. Cairo was once again ruled in the Sultan's name, but the institutions that had once sustained imperial control were now hollow. Tax flows were unreliable, provincial officials were contested, and large bodies of foreign troops remained in the country without a stable fiscal structure to support them. What followed was not a restoration, but a redistribution of power. The Ottomans required armed forces to maintain order, yet lacked the funds to pay them consistently. Albanian mercenaries originally deployed to stabilize the province became political actors in their own right. Authority shifted toward those who could guarantee wages supplies and protection rather than those who held imperial titles. Civil conflict did not arise from ideological revolt. It emerged from insolvency. Governors rose and fell, not because they were rejected politically, but because they could not meet payrolls. Cairo became a city governed by contracts alliances and negotiated loyalties rather than by imperial decree. Control belonged to whoever could stabilize daily life under conditions the empire could no longer manage. By the beginning of the 19th century, Egypt remained an Ottoman province in name, but its political future was already being decided internally. Power had migrated away from formal appointment and toward practical administration. The province was no longer awaiting direction from Constantinople. It was awaiting a ruler who could replace a failing imperial system with a functioning one. Muhammad Ali did not rise through open rebellion or ideological declaration. He emerged through negotiation alignment and selective restraint inside a system that could no longer govern itself. Among the Albanian officers stationed in Egypt, he distinguished himself less by rank than by his ability to mediate between armed forces, local elites, and urban authorities, who were all searching for stability rather than loyalty to distant rule. While successive Ottoman governors attempted to impose authority through formal office, they lacked the fiscal base to make their authority effective. Taxes could not be collected reliably, and without predictable revenue, military payrolls collapsed. Each failed administration strengthened those who could provide what the state could not. Muhammad Ali began to assume practical administrative functions, distributing pay, regulating markets, and arbitrating disputes, gradually replacing formal governance with working governance. His legitimacy formed quietly. Religious leaders supported him because markets stabilized under his arrangements. Merchants supported him because trade routes reopened. Soldiers supported him because wages resumed. None of these alliances required him to claim sovereignty. They required only that daily life became predictable again. Authority in Cairo shifted not through decree, but through habit. The Ottoman court initially resisted formalizing this transformation. Recognizing Muhammad Ali risked conceding that imperial structures were no longer sufficient. Yet every attempt to remove him deepened instability and threatened the very revenues Constantinople depended upon. Stability became more valuable than formality. In 1805, the Sultan acknowledged a reality that already existed by appointing Muhammad Ali governor of Egypt. This appointment did not bind Egypt more tightly to the empire. It institutionalized a new kind of autonomy. Muhammad Ali now held imperial legitimacy while retaining an independent power base rooted in local finance, military loyalty, and social alliances. His position depended less on imperial favor than on continued performance. Egypt had not separated from the empire. It had quietly learned how to function without it. From this moment, Egypt's future would be shaped by what its ruler could build, not by what the empire could command. To preserve stability, Muhammad Ali would have to construct institutions capable of financing training and sustaining power internally. The tools required to keep Egypt governable would soon make it powerful. Muhammad Ali's first governing decisions were shaped less by ideology than by arithmetic. Order in Egypt now depended on predictable revenue. The existing system of tax farming, in which local intermediaries collected and remitted payments, could not guarantee either stability or solvency. To secure both, he moved to bring the economy under centralized control. The state claimed monopoly rights over major agricultural products, particularly cotton and grain. Farmers were required to sell their harvest to government agents at fixed prices, and these goods were exported through state-managed channels. The arrangement redirected profit away from private networks and into the provincial treasury. While burdensome to producers, it created a reliable fiscal core capable of sustaining administration and military reform. With revenue stabilized, Muhammad Ali turned to the construction of a modern army. European officers were recruited to introduce standardized training, discipline, and logistics. Egypt's forces were reorganized into a standing institution rather than a temporary collection of mercenaries. For the first time in generations, Cairo could mobilize troops, supply them, and coordinate campaigns through centralized command. These reforms altered Egypt's relationship with the Ottoman state. The province no longer relied entirely on imperial protection to maintain order. It could defend itself, enforce internal authority, and project power outward. Egypt remained formally subordinate, but functionally independent in the domains that mattered most to governance. As Egypt's institutions strengthened, its value to the empire increased. Requests for Egyptian military assistance became more frequent, particularly in regions where Ottoman authority was weak. Each deployment would extend Egypt's reach while reinforcing its legitimacy as an imperial stabilizer. Expansion would now proceed not through rebellion, but through service. By building the machinery required to keep Egypt governable, Muhammad Ali had also constructed the machinery that would allow it to grow. Stability had produced capacity. Capacity would soon produce territory. The first outward extension of Egypt's new capacity occurred under Ottoman request rather than Egyptian initiative. In the early 19th century, the empire struggled to contain unrest in Arabia. Control of Mecca and Medina carried religious legitimacy and political authority. Yet imperial forces could no longer secure the region alone. The Sultan turned to Cairo, not as a subordinate, but as a stabilizing partner. Egyptian armies were deployed southward with formal authorization. The campaign was expensive, but it succeeded in restoring order around the holy cities. For Muhammad Ali, the outcome established a precedent. Egyptian troops could operate beyond the Nile Valley, administer distant territories, and do so in the empire's name. Expansion was becoming routine, and legitimacy accompanied it. From Arabia, Egyptian authority moved into Sudan. These campaigns were framed as security operations and border consolidation. In practice, they extended Cairo's administrative reach deep into new territories. Timber gold and enslaved labor were incorporated into Egypt's state economy, further strengthening the fiscal base that sustained reform and expansion. Imperial authorities did not obstruct this growth. Egypt's conquests were treated as extensions of Ottoman governance, even when they were administered independently. The empire's dependence on Egypt deepened during the Greek revolt of the 1820s. Once again, Ottoman forces proved insufficient to suppress rebellion. Muhammad Ali was asked to intervene. This time, he demanded compensation. Crete, with its ports and strategic position across Mediterranean trade routes, was offered in return for Egyptian military commitment. The agreement formalized a new relationship. Egyptian forces would restore imperial order, and Egypt would receive territory that extended its own reach. Expansion was now structured into imperial crisis management. Egypt was not dismantling the empire. It was becoming the system through which the empire functioned. By the late 1820s, Egypt's authority stretched from the Nile into Arabia, Sudan, and across the Mediterranean. Its growth appeared legitimate, durable, and sanctioned. The province had become a regional system in its own right, operating within imperial form while increasingly defining imperial substance. Egypt's position as an imperial stabilizer began to shift as European governments turned their attention to the Greek revolt. While Egyptian forces achieved success on land, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean was being recalculated elsewhere. Britain, France, and Russia increasingly viewed both Greek independence and Egypt's growing naval presence as strategic questions that would shape access to trade routes, ports, and influence across the region. In 1827, European fleets intervened directly. At Navarino, they destroyed Egypt's newly modernized navy. The engagement did not merely end a campaign. It erased an institutional project that had taken years to construct. The fleet had been designed to transport troops, protect commerce, and anchor Egypt's Mediterranean reach. Its loss reduced Egypt's maritime capacity to a fraction of what it had been. For Muhammad Ali, the consequences were structural rather than symbolic. Egypt had invested heavily in military reform under the expectation that imperial service would yield lasting territorial and political return. Navarino demonstrated that European intervention could override Ottoman agreements and invalidate Egyptian calculations. The empire's promises could be nullified by powers beyond the imperial system. By 1830, Greek independence was recognized and the compensation Egypt had been promised became uncertain. Egypt had fulfilled its obligations. It had not secured its returns. The logic that had underpinned expansion through service had been weakened. The destruction of Egypt's navy also clarified the limits of its independence. Egypt could reorganize armies, centralize revenue, and govern territory, but it could not control the Mediterranean balance of power. Its growth would now depend less on imperial negotiation and more on European tolerance. Rather than retreat, Muhammad Ali recalculated. He sought compensation not through appeals but through leverage. Egypt still possessed a powerful land army. If maritime limits constrained him, territorial expansion might restore what naval loss had taken away. In 1831, Muhammad Ali redirected Egypt's expansion northward. Egyptian armies crossed into the Levant, a region that linked Egypt to Anatolia and controlled the commercial corridors of the eastern Mediterranean. The campaign was framed as a demand for compensation and administrative reform rather than as rebellion. Cairo presented its advance as a correction to imperial mismanagement rather than a challenge to imperial authority. The Ottoman response revealed the depth of imperial decline. Most imperial forces were stationed on distant frontiers, leaving Syria and Palestine lightly defended. Egyptian troops moved rapidly through the region, securing ports, administrative centers, and supply routes. By the time Ottoman armies attempted to resist, Egypt controlled most of the eastern Mediterranean coastline south of Anatolia. When imperial forces finally met the Egyptian army in open battle, they were decisively defeated. The outcome confirmed what had already become visible. Egypt's reformed military now outperformed the Sultan's own armies in coordination, logistics, and command. Control of former imperial heartlands passed into Egyptian administration. Despite this success, Muhammad Ali halted his advance short of Anatolia. He did not attempt to dismantle the Ottoman state. He understood that the empire's collapse would trigger European intervention. Instead, he pursued negotiations seeking formal recognition of what Egypt had already secured through force. This restraint defined Egypt's territorial high point. Cairo now governed Sudan, Arabia, Crete, and the Levant. It controlled strategic ports and inland trade routes. Egypt had become a regional empire in function, if not in law. Yet this empire existed by tolerance rather than by sovereignty. Its legitimacy rested on settlement rather than on recognition. Egypt had expanded as far as the international system would allow. What remained uncertain was how long that tolerance would endure. The settlement reached in 1833 transformed military success into negotiated authority. Under European pressure, the Ottoman government accepted Egypt's control over the Levant, Crete, and parts of Arabia. Egypt remained an Ottoman province in law, but these territories were granted to Muhammad Ali as hereditary possessions during his lifetime. The agreement stabilized the frontier while redefining power inside the imperial system. This arrangement created an empire without a sovereign foundation. Egypt administered vast territories, collected revenue, and deployed armies across them, yet its authority rested on diplomatic tolerance rather than legal independence. Its empire was real in function but conditional in legitimacy. The same powers that had brokered the agreement retained the ability to revise it. For Muhammad Ali, the treaty offered security and vulnerability at the same time. The Levant's agricultural production, customs revenue, and port access strengthened Egypt's economy and sustained its military reforms. But these gains were held at the pleasure of external governments whose strategic interests were not aligned with the long-term growth of a new Mediterranean power. Within Egypt's leadership, the settlement was interpreted differently. Muhammad Ali viewed it as a durable platform for internal consolidation. His son Ibrahim regarded it as an incomplete outcome that left Egypt's potential unrealized. The difference was not personal ambition alone. It reflected a strategic divide over whether Egypt's future lay within tolerated boundaries or beyond them. The treaty therefore marked both the apex and the fault line of Egypt's expansion. Egypt had reached its widest territorial arc, but it had done so without securing the legal foundations that would allow it to endure. The equilibrium established in 1833 proved temporary. Ottoman leaders, unsettled by Egypt's rise, prepared to recover the territories they had lost. Egypt's expansion challenged not only the empire's borders, but the logic of imperial authority itself. A provincial governor now governed lands that had once anchored imperial control. When Ottoman forces attempted to reverse Egypt's gains, they again failed. Egyptian armies met them in open battle and prevailed, reopening the question of whether the empire could still enforce its own territorial order. Egypt's forces stood deep within former imperial provinces, holding positions that had once defined the empire's internal structure. At this point, Egypt's leadership diverged. Ibrahim believed the moment had come to press further. With the young sultan newly on the throne, he argued that Egypt could dictate the future shape of the empire itself. His calculation rested on the assumption that European governments would tolerate the collapse or restructuring of Ottoman authority. Muhammad Ali did not share this assumption. He understood that Egypt's power existed within boundaries established by external actors. Advancing further risked transforming Egypt from a stabilizing partner into a destabilizing challenger. The same governments that had accepted Egypt's growth could become its opponents. European governments acted before Egypt could decide. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia issued a collective ultimatum demanding Egyptian withdrawal from the Levant. In return, they offered hereditary recognition of Muhammad Ali's rule in Egypt itself. The message was unambiguous. Egypt could remain autonomous. It could not remain expansive. Internal hesitation slowed Egypt's response. While Cairo deliberated, diplomatic pressure hardened. What had begun as a military advantage was turning into a diplomatic constraint. France appeared to offer Egypt a temporary opening. For years, French officials had cultivated political and commercial ties with Cairo, and they expressed dissatisfaction with settlements negotiated without Paris's participation. Publicly, French diplomats questioned whether Egypt had been treated fairly and hinted that its compensation claims deserved reconsideration. French warships were dispatched to the eastern Mediterranean as a display of solidarity. The gesture suggested that European unity might fracture and that Egypt might not face collective enforcement alone. In Cairo, this was interpreted as a sign that negotiations could be reopened and that time might work in Egypt's favor. Muhammad Ali did not reject the European ultimatum outright. He delayed. The pause was calculated to test whether diplomatic divisions would produce revised terms. Egypt's leadership hoped that European governments would soften their demands to avoid confrontation with France. But French support remained bounded by domestic political realities. Paris faced internal instability and limited appetite for a broader war. Symbolic gestures were not matched by firm military commitments. While public statements continued, concrete backing did not follow. As European governments maintained their position, Egypt's diplomatic space narrowed. The delay that had been intended to increase leverage instead allowed the coalition to consolidate its stance. What had seemed like an emerging buffer began to dissolve. By waiting for divisions that would not materialize, Egypt surrendered the advantage of momentum. The window that had once allowed expansion was closing under coordinated pressure. In Paris, the limits of symbolic support became clear. French leaders recognized that continued confrontation with other European powers over Egypt carried risks that outweighed potential gains. The French fleet was ordered to withdraw, and diplomatic language softened. Public expressions of solidarity gave way to quiet disengagement. For Muhammad Ali, this reversal removed Egypt's final buffer. The possibility of balancing European pressure through French alignment disappeared, leaving Egypt exposed to a unified coalition. What had once been a multilateral negotiation became a unilateral demand. European fleets moved to enforce their terms. Egyptian coastal positions and maritime supply routes became vulnerable, and Egypt's dependence on seaborne trade turned maritime exposure into strategic constraint. Land victories could not compensate for naval isolation. The coalition's terms were restated without modification. Egypt was required to withdraw from the Levant, Arabia, and Crete. In return, Muhammad Ali would retain hereditary rule over Egypt. The choice was framed not as victory or defeat, but as survival or confrontation. At this point, Egypt's options were bounded by structural realities. Continued resistance would invite direct conflict with multiple great powers, threaten trade, and undermine internal stability. Withdrawal would preserve Egypt as a state, though at the cost of its external empire. The limits of tolerated power were no longer implicit. They were explicit. The settlement formalized Egypt's contraction. Egyptian forces were withdrawn from the Levant, Arabia, and Crete. Administrative systems built over decades were dismantled, and territories that had been governed from Cairo were returned to Ottoman administration under European supervision. The regional structure that had made Egypt a Mediterranean power was methodically undone without a decisive battlefield defeat. In exchange, Muhammad Ali's hereditary rule in Egypt was formally secured. The dynasty retained control over the Nile Valley, and Egypt's internal administration was left largely intact. Cairo remained within the Ottoman framework in name, but its domestic institutions were no longer subject to daily imperial interference. Egypt lost its empire, but it preserved its state. The consequences were structural. Revenue sources drawn from the Levant and Arabia disappeared. Strategic depth was removed. Egypt's military posture shifted from expansionary to defensive. The same reforms that had enabled Egypt to build an empire now served primarily to preserve internal order and autonomy. The settlement did not portray Egypt as defeated. It portrayed Egypt as contained. European governments had not intervened to punish Muhammad Ali, but to prevent the consolidation of a new imperial center in the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt was allowed to remain strong, but only within boundaries that others could supervise. In securing dynastic survival, Egypt accepted geographic contraction. Its future would now be shaped by what it was permitted to be, rather than by what it had demonstrated it could become. European intervention was guided less by loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan than by concern for the structure of the eastern Mediterranean itself. The region connected Europe to Asia, controlled maritime trade corridors, and bordered emerging colonial spheres. An Egypt that governed the Levant, Arabia, Crete, and Sudan would have formed a new imperial center whose alliances, commercial systems, and military posture could not be easily anticipated or managed. By preserving the Ottoman framework while constraining Egypt's expansion, European governments produced a controlled balance. Egypt remained strong enough to govern itself and maintain internal stability, but not strong enough to reorganize the regional order. Its autonomy could be supervised. Its empire could not. This containment reshaped Egypt's future. European commercial influence expanded through trade concessions, infrastructure projects, and political mediation. Egypt's independence became functional rather than formal, and its ambitions shifted inward as external authority narrowed. The contraction of Egypt's empire did not arise from collapse or incompetence. It arose from the logic of a system that tolerated strength only while it remained manageable. Muhammad Ali had built an empire by navigating that system. It ended when its scale exceeded what the system could contain.